Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. This is a video about American law reports, usually referred to by the abbreviation ALRs. This is a very helpful source for finding cases on a narrow legal issue, but it does have a steep learning curve. It is important that you do put in the time to learn how to effectively use it. That's what we're going to do. Now, like I said, ALRs are a powerful tool with lots of practical utility. They are also a real challenge to learn to use. Two aspects of that challenge will stick out to you. First, that ALRs just contain a ton of information. That's part of why they're so useful, but also contributes to the difficulty of using them. Second, that ALRs just don't have the best interface, which tends to amplify the difficulties created by that density of information. However, the immense practical utility of ALRs means that it's totally worth it to surmount that challenge. So what is an ALR? It's a secondary source that offers practical, almost exhaustive coverage organized by issue. Each separate legal issue gets its own article that is somewhat confusingly called an annotation. This naming convention stems from the fact that this coverage used to revolve around leading cases for each issue, which were reprinted in full at the beginning of the annotation, with the rest of the materials styled as an annotation to that leading case. But that idea of a leading case is not really actually very important to how people use ALRs these days. Now, as you know, we usually think about issues when we organize our legal research, and this makes the format and organization of ALRs a great fit. This actually contributes greatly to their practical utility. This issue-based organization also means that it is very important that you find the right ALR annotation, the one that's the best match for your legal issue. Otherwise, you can just end up wasting a lot of time. The beginning of the annotation has a scope section that you'll be using to do this, which we're going to talk more about a little later. Now, for each of our issues, for each annotation, ALRs will give us national coverage, all 50 states. In this respect, it's similar to our national legal encyclopedias that we've looked at, like ALRs and CJS. And this makes ALRs a useful tool for finding persuasive authority in the sense of cases from outside of our particular jurisdiction. It can also be handy if you're advising a large client who operates in a bunch of different jurisdictions. However, it does also represent a bit of a drawback in some ways, because we will encounter a lot of sources that won't necessarily be especially relevant to us if we're still focused on that search for mandatory authority. We'll learn how to filter some of those out and work with that, but it's not always as intuitive to do that as it can be for some other sources. Now, also like ALRs and CJS, American Law Reports is published by Thomson Reuters, the parent company for Westlaw. They are also licensed to Lexis, so you can find them on that platform as well, but you won't find all of the ALRs on Lexis, and the interface you'll encounter there is also just objectively worse, which is important because it just isn't a great interface to begin with. So you're really going to want to use ALRs on Westlaw if that's available to you. So when would you use ALRs in your research? Well, I would say you would use them roughly in the middle of your legal research process. You'll want to use them after you do your preliminary analysis, because if you know absolutely nothing about the law as it relates to your issue, if you don't know the core concepts and the terminology used, you're going to have a really tough time finding the right ALR annotation. But on the other hand, if you use them after you've mostly completed the codified law and case law steps of that legal research process, ALRs will lose a lot of their utility. So you'll want to use them before you've progressed too far in that process. But in some situations, using an ALR a little bit earlier in your research can make sense. If you're having difficulty figuring out how the different elements of your issue should be broken down and analyzed, certain ALRs tend to do a really good job of breaking down a claim or cause of action into its elements or sub-issues. This is especially true for statutory claims. If you're using ALRs for this purpose, you'll want to look for the ones entitled construction or application of so-and-so statute or something along those lines. Still, by far, the most common and the most important use of ALRs is to find persuasive authority, especially when the legal issue that you're dealing with is factually intensive. An ALR will go methodically through the various aspects of the issue, giving you cases that go both ways for each, along with short factual summaries of those cases. This can really help you find a case that closely resembles your own fact pattern in some respect, in a case which might otherwise be difficult and tedious to locate using other methods. Now, ALRs are also extremely handy if you find one that just happens to be a really precise fit for your issue or for your factual scenario. ALRs can just be super specific, which can make them somewhat tricky to use, but if you can find a really close fit like this, you are golden. The cases it will point you towards inside and outside of your jurisdiction, mandatory and persuasive alike, will ultimately save you just a ton of time. And the annotation will, in all likelihood, direct you towards some sources you never would have even found otherwise. So it's super helpful. So yeah, that should give you some idea of what ALRs are and when they might be helpful. The key takeaways are that ALRs are very narrow, but this narrow issue-based organization is a good match for the way that we actually research the law. They are most helpful for finding cases, particularly persuasive authority on a factually intensive rule or standard. Now, in the next video, I plan to talk about how you would go about finding the best ALR annotation and giving you some examples, which will help you to better understand some of the things that I've talked about in this video. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.